Resident Evil definitely has no shortage of iconic protagonists throughout the franchise, with legends such as the core four of Leon, Jill, Chris, and Claire to fan favorites like Barry Burton and Ada Wong. The playable protagonist of the franchise is one of the most charming traits of the Resident Evil franchise. With that being said, not all of the main characters of the franchise get the love and attention that they deserve. And on today's episode, I'm taking a look at some of the underappreciated characters of the franchise. Starting with the ground rules, I'm only including playable characters. DLC and bonus games can be used as additional background for an entry, but if they don't appear as a playable character in the main story of a Resident Evil game, at least for a brief amount of time, then they won't be considered for today's video. Finally, since this list is focusing on underrated characters, I think it's fair to say that any characters that have appeared in more than 2 entries shouldn't be included for this list. Obviously, remakes won't count as an additional entry though. Before we get started though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel if you like the content that I bring you guys. Also leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerd Space Games, and this is my top 10 underrated Resident Evil playable characters. Let's get it. Number 10, Helena Harper, Resident Evil 6.
No more tears! Not until I avenge your death. Please. Forgive me.
Helena Harper gets a lot of heat for multiple different reasons. Firstly, she appears in what is argued as one of the worst numbered entries of the franchise. On top of that, her character makes some decisions that don't really sit well with the fans, and she somehow avoids all the consequences of her actions. However, when you look more closely at Helena's character, the fact is that she probably made some choices that I feel like a lot of us would have made in her place. As Leon's partner in RE6, we learned that Helena played a part in the assassination of the President of the United States. Granted, she wasn't fully aware what was going to happen, but her actions led to the death of the president and most of the population of the town of Tall Oaks. Of course, we learned that Helena was actually forced to do these things as her sister, Deborah, was kidnapped by Simmons and used as leverage to push Helena to do his biddings. But in Helena's defense, she spends the majority of the campaign making up for her actions by trying to stop Simmons. Still, fans were pretty disappointed with no legal actions being taken at the end of the game, and the fact that she was even reinstated as an agent, despite the circumstances surrounding the death of the president. But her backstory and the character's portrayal throughout the events of the Resident Evil 6 game made her an interesting new character, and it's unfortunate that we haven't seen her return since then. Number 9, Clancy Jarvis, Resident Evil 7.
But you gotta eat all of it.
I'm not eating that. It smells like shit.
I worked all day on that, you ungrateful prick! I made it with love!
The name Clancy Jarvis might not jump out to you right away, as he's a playable protagonist in only small sections of the main story of Resident Evil 7. In the main story, we only see him twice, and both times are in the form of videotapes. The first time we see Clancy is when he and his team break into the Baker estate, in which his friends are killed and he's captured. After which we don't see him again until the Happy Birthday tape, which in my opinion is probably the best puzzle of the entire game. Here, Lucas Baker forces Clancy to play in a mini escape room filled with dangerous traps. Unfortunately for Clancy, this eventually leads to his death. However, in DLC, we see Clancy experience much more torture in between the events of both videotapes. In one tape, Clancy is forced to play a Saw-inspired experience in the form of a deadly game of 21. In another, Clancy has to escape a bedroom before Marguerite Baker catches him. In the final tape, Clancy must survive until 5 AM while a ton of molded creatures attack him. His character is extremely underappreciated and easily forgettable, but honestly, seeing what he goes through is kind of insane. The guy is persistent and definitely fights hard to survive. Number 8, Ark Thompson, Resident Evil Survivor.
But I just can't remember. Ark Thompson, huh?
Ark is definitely someone that most people would not recognize in terms of main protagonists in Resident Evil games. A big reason for that comes from the fact that Ark only appeared in a single spin-off Resident Evil game, Resident Evil Survivor. As a light gun shooter, Survivor definitely strays away from the core mechanics seen in RE games up until now, and instead puts the player in a first-person arcade-style shooter. However, what really stands out about this game is the main character, Ark Thompson. Starting off as a man with amnesia who falls out of a chopper, Ark has no memories of who he was up until this point. Throughout the course of the story, Ark unravels who he actually is, and at one point, he thinks he's the man that caused the Sheva Island outbreak. Fortunately, it's revealed that he is actually an agent sent by his good friend and everybody's favorite rookie cop, Leon S. Kennedy. Most people assume Ark Thompson and the events of Resident Evil Survivor are considered non-canon, but it's actually the opposite. Thanks to the opening of RE0, we see that the Sheva Island outbreak is canon, the island that serves as the main setting of Resident Evil Survivor. With this game being considered canon and Ark's close relationship to Leon Kennedy, it's somewhat surprising that we have yet to see this character return in a future entry. Number 7, Mia Winters, Resident Evil 7.
Mia, how?
There's no time. You have to get out of here and find her. Here, take this.
What? Wait, what are you doing? What are you doing?
Saving your life. You need to go. I won't be able to resist for much longer.
With the ending of RE Village and its Shadows of Rose DLC, Ethan's story has now been concluded and his daughter's story looks to be continued in future mainline or spin-off Resident Evil games. Unfortunately, there's one character within that family that I feel like we never got to fully explore, who I found to have a very interesting backstory, that of course being Mia Winters. During the events of RE7, we learned that Mia Winters is working for an organization that creates BOWs. This organization is known as the Connections. Also during RE7, we see Mia's combat skills put to the test as she battles against molded creatures and Evelyn in order to save her husband, Ethan. We also see Mia in banned footage as well as a videotape in which she must avoid Marguerite Baker. Unfortunately, Mia's skills are never put to the test again. Thanks to being imprisoned by Mother Miranda for the majority of Village, the real Mia is only seen near the end and never gets to say a final goodbye to her husband prior to his sacrifice. On top of that, it doesn't seem like Mia is involved in the future of the franchise, as it seems like Chris has primarily taken over as a guardian figure to Rose, and if that is the case, then it's a damn shame. Mia has a lot of baggage and backstory to be explored, mainly being her relationship with the Connections. As of now, we barely know anything about this organization except for the fact that they created the BOW Evelyn. A character like Mia has so much story to tell, and she doesn't get a lot of love due to her being overshadowed by the rest of the characters in the Winter Saga, including Ethan, Zoe, Rose, and even Chris Redfield. Number 6, the Outbreak characters, Resident Evil Outbreak. Originally, I planned to include some of the characters from Outbreak as separate entries on today's list, but then I realized that more than half of this list would have been filled with the survivors in the Outbreak files. While it's not confirmed or unconfirmed as canon in the mainline Resident Evil universe, the Outbreak Files is without a doubt the most underappreciated game of the franchise. Released as an online co-op experience before online play became popular, Outbreak Files 1 and 2 followed a handful of survivors during the events of the Raccoon City outbreak. Each of these survivors had unique personalities and backgrounds, as they were each everyday residents of Raccoon City prior to the outbreak. Kevin, usually viewed as the most popular character from this game, was a cop with an optimistic view about everything. David, a mechanic and a plumber that usually keeps to himself and has a mysterious vibe about him. Mark, a Vietnam veteran that now works as a security guard and is now a family man who spends most of the time worrying about his wife and daughter during the outbreak. And many, many more. Each of these characters have simple yet relatable personality traits and background, and none of them get a lot of love due to them being in a spin-off game that never really took off. Number 5, Jake Muller, Resident Evil 6.
Just promise me you'll survive. The world depends on it.
Who the hell are you to tell me what to do?
Stop it!
Put your gun down, now!
Tell me, we just following orders? Or was it personal?
Both.
Listen, I have no problem admitting that Jake's campaign at Resident Evil 6 was my least favorite in the game. With that being said, it had nothing to do with Jake's character. My problems primarily came from the focus on the Jet Li stylized action segments instead of the survival horror gameplay that the franchise was built upon. Still, when you take a look at Jake's past, he's a character that actually has a lot of promise. We learned during the events of RE6 that Jake is the son of the infamous reoccurring villain of the franchise, the Albert Wesker. Seeing a protagonist who is the son of the biggest villain of the series is something that would have been great to see play out to its fullest, especially considering the conflict that he would immediately have with characters like Barry and Jill. Yeah, we got to see a small snippet of some conflict between Chris and Jake, but it was brief and honestly a bit underwhelming. However, in Barry and Jill's case, it may have been a bit more difficult for them to see past the sins of Jake's father, considering that Wesker kidnapped and threatened Barry's family, and the fact that Wesker forced Jill to do some really bad things via mind control. Both have a lot more to hate Wesker for than Chris did. Unfortunately, we'll probably never see Jake again unless Capcom decides to take on the ultimate task of remaking Resident Evil 6 following the remake of RE5. Regardless, Jake's past and his abilities are things that shouldn't be ignored completely, and in my opinion, he remains as one of the most underappreciated characters of the franchise. Number 4, Sheva Alomar, Resident Evil 5.
My parents were involved in an accident caused by a pharmaceutical company when I was young.
Umbrella?
Yes. I only found out later that the accident was to cover up the manufacturing of biological weapons for terrorists.
Speaking of underappreciated characters of the franchise, it doesn't feel right to make this list without including one of the most underrated protagonists of the franchise, Sheva Alomar. The funny thing about this is that Sheva just does everything right to stand out as an iconic protagonist of the franchise. Yet when people talk about Chris's partners of the series, usually Jill and Pierce are the first to come to mind. Most people, unless they are big fans of Resident Evil 5, fail to mention how great of a partner Sheva Alomar was. Perhaps that's due to Jill being a recurring character of the series and Pierce paying the ultimate sacrifice at the end of RE6, but I still feel like Sheva deserves some recognition for the things that she accomplished. Her backstory is connected to Umbrella, like many legendary characters of the series are. In her situation, her village was taken advantage of by Umbrella and used for testing that ultimately cost the lives of her family. Then, following the events of RE5, we eventually see Sheva team up with Chris to do what most other characters failed to do: kill Albert Wesker. She's a fantastic character that is very close to Chris, as we see in a message to Pierce in RE6. Unfortunately, she tends to get overshadowed by Chris's other partners, like Jill and Pierce, but she definitely deserves a lot of love for being one of the best badasses of the franchise. Number 3, Sherry Birkin, Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 6.
That's alright. Besides, I didn't walk out of it empty-handed.
Yeah, you got superpowers.
That's not what I meant. The people who saved me, Leon and Claire, are the closest friends I've ever had.
Claire is that BSAA guy's sister, right?
They risked their lives for me back in Raccoon City. I guess I'm still just trying to live up to their example. Never giving up, no matter the odds.
Up until now, most of the characters on today's list only appeared in a single Resident Evil game. However, in Sherry's case, she was playable in not one, but 2 mainline entries. Sure, the first time that we play as Sherry, she's pretty useless as she's a young girl, but the second time turns hopeless Sherry into the invincible queen that we see in Resident Evil 6. Like I said with Jake, Sherry's campaign is my least favorite of RE6. And again, like with Jake, it has nothing to do with Sherry's character. In fact, I felt like the relationship between Sherry and Jake was the best part of that campaign. Similar to how Jake is the son of a previous villain of the franchise, Sherry's father is William Birkin, the man behind the Raccoon City outbreak and the creation of the G-Virus. During the events of RE2, Sherry found herself infected by the G-Virus. Even though she was given the antidote, it seems that the G-Virus still had an effect on her. As we learn in Resident Evil 6, she now has healing abilities. What really makes Sherry stand out compared to most characters of the franchise is how much of her life has been affected by BOWs and Umbrella. She was a child during the outbreak in Raccoon City, and then she was tested on and experimented on for many years following the events of Raccoon City. And even now, we see her as a government agent fighting against BOWs, trying to retrieve the antibodies that will help fight against the new C-Virus. Sherry Birkin is easily one of the most underappreciated characters of the franchise, and despite being one of the 4 main survivors of Resident Evil 2, it seems she receives the least amount of respect and appreciation out of all 4 of them. Number 2, Carlos Oliveira, Resident Evil 3.
Jill! Hey, answer me. God damn it. Tyrell, do you copy?
What's going on?
Jill's been infected. I'm taking her to the hospital. Maybe Dr. Bard can save her.
All right, I'll meet you there.
You hang in there, Super Cop. I got you.
Carlos is one of those few main playable characters that have only appeared in a single entry. Yet Carlos is easily one of the most robbed characters of the franchise, as it really seems he can never catch a break. The first time we see him is in the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis game. Here, Carlos comes off as an offensive stereotype and to some extent obnoxious. Still, there was some kind of charm about Carlos that had ultimately won over hardcore fans of Resident Evil 3, and to this day, there's a few of us out there that would defend this portrayal of him. Yet there's no denying the fact that Carlos in the remake was leaps and bounds better than the original version of him. Carlos somehow became even more charming, less annoying, more interesting, and in my opinion, he was one of the best and only improvements from the original game. Unfortunately for Carlos, he's once again caught with some bad luck though. While Carlos was definitely an improvement, and some would agree Jill's character was also an improvement, most of the rest of Resident Evil 3 Remake failed to live up to the original. For that reason, Resident Evil 3 Remake was immediately met with negative feedback, and because of that, Carlos's improvements were easily ignored. Despite Carlos being one of the most interesting one-off characters, thanks to the changes that the remake brought to him, he'll probably be left in the dust and once again be forgotten due to the criticism of Resident Evil 3 Remake. So for that reason, he's on my underappreciated and underrated characters list, and actually he comes damn close to being number 1 if it wasn't for a certain STARS medic. Number 1, Rebecca Chambers, Resident Evil 0.
I can handle this on my own. And don't call me little girl.
All right, Miss Do-It-Yourself. What should I call you?
The name is Rebecca Chambers, but that's Officer Chambers to you.
As teased in the last entry, in my opinion, out of every single underappreciated and underrated character in the Resident Evil franchise, and believe me, there are a lot, Rebecca Chambers is without a doubt my favorite of them all. While Barry Burton is famous for his one-liners and both Chris and Jill have been front and center in more games than most characters of the series, poor Rebecca Chambers is the only STARS member that just doesn't get enough recognition and love from the fans. Sure, there has been a sudden increase in her popularity thanks to her appearing in the 2 most recent CGI movies, but the fact remains that Rebecca hasn't been seen in a Resident Evil game since the events of the Spencer Mansion incident. As a reminder, Rebecca has only appeared in 2 games, the original Resident Evil and a prequel that follows her prior to Alpha Team's arrival in the Ark Mountains. What makes this sting a little more is that there were rumors surrounding a 3rd Revelations game that would focus on Rebecca Chambers while she was in college. Unfortunately, that never came to pass, and we are still left wondering when we'll see this young medic in action again within the video game universe. Her optimistic approach to everything is something that allowed Rebecca to stand out from just about every main character of the franchise thus far. Her signature thumbs up that she gives multiple characters, including both Chris and Billy, is easily one of the most adorable things I've seen in Resident Evil. Her personality is something that adds a new feeling to the Resident Evil games, and spending time with her in RE0, and even the small bit of time we spent with her in the original game, are some of my favorite moments of the franchise. For those reasons and many more, Rebecca Chambers is my personal favorite underrated character of Resident Evil. But that does it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is Rebecca Chambers the best underrated character of the franchise, or is there someone else that you think deserves that title? Let me know down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.